Now, normally, the one thing historians can be relatively sure about when they're talking about certain ships and certain things in history are the dates. That's usually the one thing we sort of agree on. We can argue about pretty much everything else, and we do. We can argue about their true tonnage, because we'll have stats which say they displaced this. And unless you actually got the ship still around, that you can actually take somewhere and measure its weight, and believe it or not, you do actually have to do that at certain points, and it's all to do with dry docking experience, and I'm not going to get into the whole fun of that one, but yeah, you do need to have an accurate measurement of a ship's displacement. And, things like their length, give or take half an inch or so, we can usually be sort of agreeing. And the beam, again, can be fairly certain about, because they actually made it through certain canals. These things are all things we can be fairly certain of, normally. And we can, to an extent, agree, or at least we're going to be within a margin of error of each other in our disagreements. And it's more arguments for fun of the historians, the fact that historians love debating history. I always find that strange when people look at us and go, why can there be differences in history? And I go, literally, historians, have you met us? The whole reason we have conferences is so we can have arguments in person instead of just in written words. That's our whole reason for being. Of course history's going to our interpretation of history is going to change. It's a constant argument, or rather, a constant discussion where people are putting forward their arguments based on the evidence that they have found which pertains to that event or thing. However, escort carriers. Oh my, oh my, oh my. I've talked about this a lot recently in the year of the aircraft carrier, because people like to bring these up for three reasons. One, whenever I talk about how the US Navy doesn't like small carriers in their history, someone will bring them up and go, but they operated escort carriers. Yes. But that was partially out of necessity, and really it wasn't their original conception for how they were going to use them. They'd been conceiving escort carriers for a long time as part of their War of the Pacific plan, and I'll be getting into that today. The British had also had some conceptions about escort carriers for similar reasons. The British had about 2 roles planned for them. The Americans had about 1 role planned for them, and ended up between them coming up with a whole 3rd role which they hadn't even considered for them, but which they turned out to be really useful in. But they are true they are, by that point, not really a war emergency build, because they're not something which is conceived and developed in wartime. They are implementing something which was definitely conceived in peacetime. I know there are many people who go, oh, well, you see, I was sitting at a dinner one day, or a lunch, and it was particularly good. There was some lovely alcohol, or in my case, if I've been out, iron brew, lovely soft drink here. And we were talking away, and I dropped this idea on the bat of a napkin. Did you really? And you then offered your own ships to be converted? Yes, I did. Oh, that's amazing. I'm sure you came up with that idea all by yourself. Whilst I'm wondering myself exactly how much the particular naval officer who was at that meeting had been coached by an NCO in how to steer a conversation and pop ideas into someone's head. All the while the NCO had been saying to the officer, of course we never use this on you, sir. Would never do this to you, sir. However, sir, you might want to consider. I can imagine that conversation now, and yeah. There again, there are some officers like Admiral Henderson, who was the 3rd Sea Lord of the Royal Navy from 33 to 39, who seem to be able to do that a lot. It's a natural skill. So there are some officers who are very skilled at managing other people's egos as well. It's just Henderson, kind of like King, tends to specialize in doing it to large groups of politicians simultaneously. One of them, affected the air of an affable, friendly gentleman who was just thinking out loud. The other one used the air of a permanently angry gentleman who you really didn't want to destabilize and upset because you might go through the window. What can I say? They work well for the systems they're in. Frankly, I have no debate with either methodology. But this is where things get interesting. Because you can read any number of books which will tell you the escort carrier comes about in World War II because of the urgencies of the time. And you look at them, and you read those notes, and then you go, what about HMS Argus in World War I? And the other conversions of merchant ships in World War I, and merchant ships used as aviation ships. They're not a precedent. They're not? No, they're different. That's World War I. What about the fact that both the US Navy and Royal Navy and the IJN and potentially at least two other navies, including the Soviets, have an ongoing planning and designing programs which feature how to convert the existing, more suitable merchant vessels to carriers? Why do you think they have, ready to go when they're doing this, a whole profile written out of what would make a suitable vessel to convert? Where do you think that's come from? Did someone just turn over and go, and pull it out? No, that isn't the case at all. They've been thinking about this for a while. It doesn't just come from nowhere. Navies don't work that way. They really don't. Every time someone sits there and goes, this is a great example of innovative, quick thinking by a Navy, you can usually find years of thought have been in the program. Years of thought. And basically the reason it's so quick is because they've already made all the decisions, they've already had all the internal debates, so they can just run with it. It's brilliant. Get all the debating and arguing over and done with and then do the program. Half the trouble we have with modern programs is they are long enough, people start having debates during the program. No, you want the debates to be over, and then when you order it, it to be a settled design. And then you just go with it and run with it. And actually, this pre-war thinking explains a lot of the factors within these ships which are selected. A lot of the focus within these ships which is selected. And what they are selected for. And what they turn out to be useful for doing. You also have to remember that the Long Island class, which come prior to them, are a couple of conversions. They are literal conversions of existing ships. The Bogue class, well, they're different. They are quite literally Type C3 cargo ship hulls. They are under construction. They are done. They are converted from finished or near finished. Is what the phrase we usually use. And converting from finish means that they have been completed, but they haven't entered service. So if we said converted from service, then they were in service and their ships would have been pulled out of service. But these are ships which were near finished or finished, and they're taken aside to be converted. 23 of the class were built from keel up. And that's usually where we start to go Bogue or Ruler class, because the rulers are the ones which are built from the keel up. And there's even the Emir class, if you want to add in a subclass as well. Now, the thing is, these ships are useful. And I'm going to be getting into the design theory, etc. on this, but the first thing I want to cover is the fact there was actually quite a big debate when they started getting into service between the Americans and the British. And the debate was the Americans looking at the British and going, why are you taking so long to put them into service? And it comes down to the fact that the American approach to them, when they'd started building them, versus the British approach them. And eventually the Americans actually changed to a system which was a lot closer to the British methodology. Because these were Woolworths carriers. They were supposed to be cheap and disposable. They were supposed to be able to do the job full in for all the second and third tier roles you need an aircraft carrier for, or rather you need a flight deck for. But the British insisted on doing their usual thing of, we are sticking in our aviation fuel management system. We don't care about you guys. If you don't want it, that's fine, but we're sticking in it. And a few other changes. This did cause the Americans to go, why are you not taking the ship straight into service? Why is it not? Why are you anglicizing it? And the British were going, it doesn't take us that long. Just fixing the fuel management system. Modifying a few other bits. Checking the radios work. We're really not critiquing the quality of work going on here. We're not. It's been the hull's been very well made. There's no place to store the alcohol. Do they run their ships dry? Oh, good God. We have to change that quite quickly. Yeah, there were important things which needed to be done. Fuel management system was literally number 1 on the list. Number 2, according to the official list, was not the installation of the facilities to support and sustain the alcohol consumption aboard. Number 2, as it seems to be in the dockyard implementing list, is in the putting in of those systems. Very important to British morale. So, yeah, I'm sorry, America. Yes, it is going to take 3 days to properly implement systems which can sustain and support the alcohol aboard, and that is going to be carried out. These are good ships. And whilst the Long Island and the Avenger/Charger class, depends who you're talking to, had also continued on some of the developments and some of the growth, there were significant differences which make these more suitable and better fits for the pre-war doctrines, really. They're steam turbine engines, whereas the predecessors had all been diesels. And diesels had reliability issues. It was interesting. Diesel is normally one of the most reliable engines you can get. The big diesel engines they were putting in the Escort Carriers prior to the Bogue class proved to have issues with reliability. And I think that was more to do with the fact that what they were being required to operate as. You see, a diesel engine is designed to keep chugging. That's what it does. It keeps chugging along. But when you're dealing with something which is acting on a carrier role, it needs to turn into the wind. It might need to turn quickly up to as fast as it can go. And whilst technically they can all do roughly the same top speed of, well, the Bogue class can do 18 knots. The others, well, in a good scenario could do 18, but normally this is 16.5. The thing is, the steam turbines are far more suitable to that sort of style and requirement of operation. And that's the thing. I think the reliability issues weren't so much the diesel engines as the diesel engines were not designed for the style of operation they were being used for. At the time, you didn't have that flexibility. You didn't have the experience in the diesel engines to do that sort of thing. You know, what would we probably do today? Well, we probably do a diesel electric system, which means you can just change the gearing on the electric generator and you can keep the diesel engine going and you can try and increase power that way and then slowly work up the diesel generator. You don't have to rapidly increase its speed, etc. Because when you're dealing with differences of ship scale, that can be problematic. At that time, steam turbines, they work great. Single screw designs, they're fine. And they have a nice long range, a nice size complement. there'll be key ship videos about all these vessels. In fact, there'll probably be multiple key ship vessels, key ship videos about these vessels, because let's be honest, with 45 in the class overall and 3 lost, I think you can justify doing quite a few videos about individual ones. So I think they deserve it. But yes, there was a bit of a difference and a bit of dispute over things which need to be included. The British also included some more space for command and control. They did some modifications there. And one of the interesting things that complicates it when I say these, point out these differences, is the Americans implement a lot of this stuff later on themselves. So that's why you then get someone going, the British were taking this long, but the Americans did this. And you have to go, well, no, the Americans didn't do that initially. The British were doing that initially, and there were people complaining about it. And then some of the people listening to the American officers complaining about it went, excuse me, old boy. You're speaking British English. This sounds weird. What do you want? Why are you doing this? And so the British explained why they were doing it. And the few USN admirals, especially those ones in the Pacific at the sharp end, really liked the ideas of why the British were doing it. Survivability. They would like the alcohol, but that wasn't happening. These ships, some of them were really cool as far as the Royal Navy were concerned, because they were the only ships which had both ice cream makers and alcohol aboard. There are things that they produce that get made on those ships, which frankly we will leave to one side. It was very rare. I think it was only about 3 or 4 of the ones in British service actually came with ice cream makers intact aboard. But there is a debate about that as well, because there was some discussion as to whether or not some of the British yards, which were doing the upgrade work, removed the ice cream maker to make space for other things. So, and some were debated as to whether all the American yards building them were fitting them. So, shameless book plug. Now, I do this a couple of minutes in every single video, so if you don't want to see this, please skip ahead. And part of the reason I do it is because as much as I love doing these videos, and I will keep doing them for as long as I can, as long as there are people willing to support my research by watching these videos, by being patrons, by doing all the YouTube chats, the YouTube, I'm not sure what the thanks are they called? I'm never quite sure what the ones are. Super chats and super thanks? I think that may be it. Anyway, and Ko-fi donations, all those things, I'm going to keep it up. And probably I will keep it up. I did it before I got those. I'll probably keep going after I do those, because I enjoy it, and I enjoyed the comments, and I enjoyed the interaction. But I'm also a university lecturer. Technically, I say at the moment, because technically I'm a contract lecturer, and in the UK, quite a lot of all the contracts I'm on, they end in pretty much end of June, and they begin again in October. So technically, I'm a YouTuber for these 2 months of the year. Yay! But in the UK, the way you get promoted, the way you get permanent posts, the way you do anything in academia is by publishing books and by how successful they are. So every single video I have, I advertise my book. I do talk about a little bit about Rivals, Battles and Daring. It's an excellent one in my view on the British destroyer program before the World War II and during and through it, and why the large destroyer was something the British were pursuing, and why the large destroyer was something in uniquely British perspective compared to other nations. They were happy to go for a gun-heavy ship rather than a torpedo-heavy ship. And it fitted with the British needs. Talks a bit about Admiral Henderson as well, which I quite like sticking in there. I'm going to have to say stick passages about him in a lot of books coming up over the next couple of years, because I'm doing my level best to talk more about him, because thanks to a lot of the autobiographies that get written post World War II and people taking a lot of stuff gets, how do I put this, written out of history. Or rather, in people remembering their own part, they kind of forget this other guy who did so much. And as the third Sea Lord in charge of procurement and construction, for the Royal Navy from 1933 till 1939 when he dies. And prior to that, the first Rear Admiral aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy, who develops a lot of the Royal Navy's carrier doctrine and carrier operations doctrine and combined carrier operation doctrine, and then is the person who leads the fight which gets the Fleet Air Arm back under Royal Navy control by the in-skip award is 37, but it was going to take till 39 for them to get it back. And does all the procurement and working to try and push things forward in that time. He's kind of a big deal, but he's kind of forgotten in history. And so I do my level best to talk about him whenever I can, because he's interesting. But what did the USN want these ships for? It seems an appropriate place to start, after all. What did the Americans, what did the US Navy want escort carriers for? Well, we've already done a video on this channel, in fact a couple of them, about HMS Unicorn. The Royal Navy's honestly not an aircraft carrier, forward aviation support ship. Well, that's what you need when you're in a scenario where you're going to be operating on the other side of the world from your logistics chain, from your center, from where your hub and all your industrial base is. What do you do if you're operating on the other side of an ocean, though? Just one ocean. You don't have to go all the way through the Atlantic, Bay of Biscay, not a bit of North Atlantic, mid-Atlantic, through Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, through the Singapore Straits, up the South China Sea, into the East China Sea, find somewhere to support a fleet. No, you just have to go across the Pacific. Just across the Pacific. What do you need? To sustain carriers and island bases. You need ferries. You need aircraft ferries. And if you're sensible, and if you consider the facilities you're likely to find at most of those islands, you're not going to have a facility to crane the aircraft on and off. Ideally, you want to be able to fly the aircraft on and off. If you do have a crane facility, you can load them up. It's always useful if you can do that. But if you don't, it doesn't matter. You can fly the aircraft off. You can even use them as a ferry for the Army Air Corps aircraft. Yeah, isn't that the US Navy helping them out? And ideally, that stops the Army Air Corps, if you have this conception. This was one of the interesting things, because the Royal Navy has a similar plan, and we'll be getting that in a bit, but the Air Ministry takes no notice of it. The Army Air Corps takes a lot of notice of this, and in many ways they are some of the biggest drivers behind the USN's ongoing program. In many ways, the program of development and discussion which goes into this almost ferry system is entirely based around keeping the Army Air Corps' political wing from being annoying. It starts under Moffat, and pretty much, Moffat spends quite a lot of his life arguing with Billy Mitchell, because Billy Mitchell has this idea that all the aviators should belong to a new air force, and they should take them away from the Navy and everything, because they can't be supported by them. And like most of the naval aviators and those involved in naval aviation, they sit there and hear the arguments of, well, you see, another service is not technically or engineeringly suited to supporting an aviation. And then they look around the Navy, which is run entirely based on engineering and dealing with this very powerful, very scary force known as steam. Live steam is a incredibly ferocious beast. And then they go, who are you talking about again? And then they would say something like, well, you see, these people, they just understand horse riding and marching. You then look at a Navy, at any point they're on parade, and go, not sure they understand the marching part that well. They do it. They certainly do it neatly, but let's be honest, they usually have to go for 6 weeks intensive training before they take part in the aforementioned marching. And then afterwards they forget it within about 6 weeks as well. And it'll have to happen again next time they want to do it. It's a lovely scenario. So yeah, that there are problems, but people sometimes base their experience and their perception of problems on their own experience and their own experience and issues, and presume that's a universal problem. It wasn't the case. But either way, one of the reasons why the Navy keeps pushing up these things, and Moffat and etc. and others push this idea forward, is because every time someone turns around and goes, well, bombers, they're going to replace the battleship because of their range, etc. The Navy, instead of getting into a whole argument, they usually have some retirees who will get in that, they merely make a comment in the committee which is along those lines. And of course, the very important aircraft ferry program, the ongoing wartime aircraft ferry program, we are keeping abreast. If we need to, we feel we can rapidly convert vessels to that role. And then some senator goes, what aircraft ferry? Well, you see, the US Army Air Corps aircraft don't have the range to be able to get to places and reliably on volume. And if you fly them, that can lead to too many losses, etc. So we have an ongoing ferry program to support them in their movement across the Pacific. It's evil, isn't it? It's cunning, but it's evil. It is pure. We are supporting them in their abilities. We're not saying aircraft aren't useful. No. We're supporting them. We're supporting them by putting in the logistics. The fact that the logistics undermines so many of their claims. It's just beautifully delicious. And so, this is one of the reasons, again, why when people turn around and go, these things are suddenly produced in wartime, I go, But here's the interesting thing. If you want an aircraft, a ship as just a ferry, well, it can be diesel. It can be quite slow. And you can build up speed slowly enough and then launch the aircraft off if you're flying them to another aircraft carrier, if they're naval aircraft, or if they're land-based aircraft, well, then they are going to have to hope they have a crane there. Especially if they're packed like these P-38s and P-47s are. But still, it works. It works. That's what the USN wanted them for when they first start thinking about them. And as said, that affects their design. But it doesn't necessarily affect how they're using them for, because again, wars change things. The USN, when they're first putting forward this idea of these ships, they are planning on a methodical war where they have a large fleet of carriers and they're slowly pushing forward, where they have the battle fleet, where they have the logistics, and the initial designs and conceptions reflect this. The ships were not at that point, when they were initially designed them, considered for a primary strike role. This is something that comes about. They were not considering having the whole dispersed effect of operations and having to operate all these different areas, because in many ways at that point they are still thinking about multiple carrier task groups, occasionally multi-carrier task groups. Please don't difference in what I said there. Multiple carrier task groups, i.e. individual carriers wandering around, and sometimes those task groups would involve more than one carrier, so then they'd be a multi-carrier task group. And if you want to do multiple, there are multiple multi-carrier task groups. And I do love they have those phraseologies, because it's sincerely not intended to confuse people, but it can really sound like you're having hiccups if you say it fast. Multiple multi-carrier task forces, or multiple multi-carrier task forces. Yep. It sounds weird, but it's true. Now, again, this affects their design. This is one of the reasons why they don't have a full-length flight deck. Because if you're thinking it more of a ferry and occasionally operating aircraft, those extra few feet don't matter. You can build out to them, you could if you wanted to, but you don't need to. You don't need to. You basically are thinking, we don't need that extra space. Whereas if you think about a carrier as an operational asset, every extra bit of flight deck matters. And you might be sitting there going, well, hang on, Alex, that's not that much. That's useful. That is useful. Also, other things you would probably be thinking about in terms of aircraft operation. Well, you've got a single hydraulic catapult, you've got a couple of elevators, lifts. They're all useful assets. They truly are. But look at that island structure. Look at the shaping of the hull form. Again, there are things you accept as compromises. And those compromises tend to be based upon what you perceive the operation of the ship is going to be. If you're thinking primarily it's a ferry, primarily it's about extending the reach of our forces and sustaining our forces forward, it's very effective. It's acceptable. Now, I'm not going to say the USN didn't consider these things as actually going to be getting into combat at some points. They did have ideas about potentially convoy escorting, etc., and those things, but those were limited roles. They were supposed to be helping them with getting across the stuff across the Pacific, because they did realise the Japanese had a very decent submarine force. And again, I cannot emphasise this more. When you're talking about war plans for Britain and for America in the late 1920s, early 1930s, believe it or not, Germany doesn't feature. Have a look at the German forces and Germany as a country in the late 1920s, early 1930s. You'll understand why. It's the same when we're talking about Italy, because for the Americans, it doesn't feature because the Americans go, huh? Mediterranean? Italy? Who cares? Has no effect on us at all. Oh, no, our trade can't flow through the Mediterranean. Oh, woe is me. We'll just have to go from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, and the Atlantic stuff is still fine, and oh, we can't get into the Mediterranean. For the British, most of their ideas about the Mediterranean are, if they find themselves at war with the Italians, involves using their carriers to strike their fleet in Taranto, and then having their battle fleets basically forming up roughly 2 6-ship battle squadrons, with 6 capital ships, and with roughly 2 carriers attached to each squadron, and cruisers and destroyers, and having one drive from the Eastern Mediterranean, one drive from the Western Mediterranean, and catching the Italian fleet in the middle and squishing them. That's pretty much the British doctrine for how to deal with the Italians if they find themselves in a war with them in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Because that's what you can do. Italy is pretty much isolated as a political power. Yes, they are powerful and strong fleet, but they manage to annoy pretty much all their neighbours. Does make things easier. It's only until the rise of the mustachioed one that the Fat Boy Fun Boy, the unimproved 20th Century Edition, really got any major international leeway and support. And let's be honest, there was never any real agreement or friendship going on between them and Italy and Japan. So that was not a scenario which was likely to happen to anyone. There was the concept of what happens if Italy causes trouble for Britain whilst we're at war with Japan. There was, at that point, though, the tacit understanding that went between British and America, Britain and America at this point, was in any war where one of them found themselves fighting Japan, the other one would have to join. Because, strategically, they can't afford for the other to become the dominant power in the Far East, and whoever humbles Japan would become the dominant power in the Far East. So that means you end up with a war where both of them are combining to fight Japan, at which point surely the British will be able to spare enough forces to also do nasty things to Italy. The British would find the forces, and remember, the British only have to find enough forces to support the French, who equal the Italians in numbers, doing what the French really want to do. Because let's be honest, the Germans are only occasional enemies for the French. The Italians are the real ones. It's a fun time in the European meetings. It really is. How did the USN use them? Well, they used them for everything. You see, once you have a flexible asset like a simple flight deck with quite a large hangar space, a couple of elevators, and a catapult, yes, it can't take many aircraft, but you can find all sorts of uses for them. You can use them to support Marines ashore. You can build an airbase ashore, but you're going to have to keep building that base every single time. And even the Royal Navy, which pre-war had the mobile naval basing units and all the Marines and sailors and systems in place to set those up. During the war, they don't actually set up as many as they thought they were going to do. So that's why some of those units are reassigned and reorganized. Pretty much they realized that it's a very sensible concept for the Mediterranean. For if you're operating from places like Crete, you can set it up and organize it. And by gum, if you'd left Crete in charge under the Royal Marine Commander who was out there, it probably wouldn't have had the mess that happened in it. Because if you keep changing senior officer. And keep them having to keep changing everything is one half the reasons which led to all the problems in Crete, because the plans got modelled as everyone came in and had their own ideas, and no one was quite sure what had been done because they only arrived a week ago. Whereas the Royal Marine, who'd been there from the beginning, if you'd left them in charge, would have just slotted everyone into their plans. It would have made for a cohesive defence, and it would have been organised, and it wouldn't have had that problem, and there would have been one staff keeping track of everything that was going on. It makes sense in the Mediterranean. When you're dealing with the sheer quantity of islands you're fighting up through in the, I don't know, Southwest Pacific, and a fairly large chunk of the Central Pacific as well, when you're doing the island hopping campaign, and all the lovely stuff through the Philippines and Indonesia, you realize very quickly you've got a lot of islands and a lot of air bases you're going to have to build, and you're going to have to build those very quickly and secure them. Well, these come along. If you've got enough of these, send them 2 or 3 of those. They'll equal most of the air bases you can build ashore quickly, and they are kind of secure from infiltrators and general ground warfare because they sit off the coast. And they bring their own spare parts, they bring all their own accommodation facilities, they bring all their own machine shops, everything is already there. This makes life a lot easier. So yeah, use them for the support role. Occasionally use them for especially supporting large amphibious operations when you need a lot of firepower ongoing, and you really don't want to leave the fleet carriers there because you have other things which are better for them to be used for. Fleet carriers should turn up for an amphibious operation for the first couple of days. Provide the initial big support, the initial overwhelming punch, and then toddle off to do other duties. You need them to be off checking, seeing if the enemy's fleet carriers are out being annoying. You've got to have them for prepping up and resupplying for the next major operation, the next major thrust. Ongoing ships taking that wear and tear of just sitting around doing consistent air operations, you must well use an escort carrier for it. And they also use them for some convoy work. They use them for protecting some of the movements of goods and convoys. And more often than not, though, they're also using them for a lot of ferry work. Look at some of what those escort carriers get up to. In fact, some of them do it so often that vessels like Kopahi actually spend their entire wartime career transporting aircraft. She literally spends her entire career going to bases like New Hebrides, Fiji's, the New Caledonia, and all sorts of islands in the Hawaiian chain, and popping around, dropping off aircraft. She even returns to America with captured Japanese aircraft aboard. She's carrying those. this is what she spends her war doing. And she's useful for that. She literally wanders along, doing that operation. You need something to do in doing it. Would you like an Essex class to be doing it? Independence class? No, you have other things you want those ships to be doing. You still need that aircraft moved around. You need that. You need the logistics done. You need the intelligence gathered from the Japanese aircraft. You need those things moved. These airships will do that for you, and that's useful. Now, I originally recorded this video, or rather a version of this video, prior to going away on the Scandi Ship 24 trip. And that's the Ship Shape group. That's myself, Drakenafel, Gareth the Brit is his tag, but I know him as Gareth, so it's always hard for me to remember that one. And Dr. Dan, and also other Dan this time. So we were really economizing on names on this trip. And we were basically going around Scandinavia looking at naval history there. And looking at the aviation history. And it was glorious. It was so much fun. I think there's already a video on Drax's channel from that trip. My videos are all going to be part of the Christmas series. When I do, as you know, every year about Christmas period, I set out to try and put up 80 to 90 days of continuous videos. I do that to cover that period because from experience of friends, of losing friends, that's the period when people get really lonely. And lonely people, especially people who've been through trauma in their lives, can go down some dark mental paths and end up causing a lot of hurt, which they probably didn't realize, or hopefully didn't realize they were going to cause. And as such, well, there's not much you can do. But there have been a few people over the years. You know, there's a quite famous comedian in the UK who pointed out, he's called Jimmy Carr, who pointed out that he has a story where someone had made the decision that they were going to end their life because of the dark path they'd gone down. And they made a decision, so they were okay, but they decided they wanted to wait till their family was in bed. And they started to amuse themselves, and while waiting, they watched his videos on YouTube. And they just kept watching those videos. And by morning, they hadn't done it, because they just kept being distracted by the videos going through them, and their family found them and stopped them. And I have my own anecdotal sort of stories of friends who have been watching videos, and the time passed, let's say. And so, in that, every year, in that period, that's when when I make sure I have a whole bank of videos stacked up. All the key ships combat response videos, they're all in that period. There's a reason the key ship combat response videos come out at roughly, and I have to say this, it's roughly 3 a.m. every single morning for that period, because they are long enough and they'll lead people into enough history videos and enough discussions that I think, well, you know, if someone's at that point, that might work, that might help. And then there are shorts, which usually come out about 1100 hours every single day in that period, and then there'll be other videos which will come out at about 1900 hours. That's why I do it every year. And that's where my videos for this were going. But also this year, my videos from the Australia trip, which I did manage to produce last year, because, and I had to admit, I did drop the ball last year massively because my mum was ill and was in hospital and I was dealing with all that, so I didn't manage to do what I normally do. And I apologise for that. But yeah. So these videos and the Australia videos are going to be coming out all through the Christmas season, along with all the other stuff, and I will be publishing at some point the Christmas videos list and the details of what that's going to be. I will probably be publishing that about the same time I do the Historathon, which I've got coming up, which is going to be basically a bit like a sort of donathon to fund some major things for that I'm doing for various history related research topics and books and putting all those things together. And basically the idea is going to be I'm going to do 24 hours of naval history streaming on YouTube. Maybe slightly longer. Maybe I'll see how long I can go before I have to crack and go to bed. We'll see. Let's see. I've got that idea for probably October time. Should be fun. So, now we're into what the RN wanted them for. The RN's program pretty much can be described as we have a global maritime trade network. Yes. Aircraft can reach convoys and reach things and attack them, so we need something to protect convoys from air attack. And we know fighters are good for that. Surface raiders, it's probably best if convoys avoid them, but especially if we can spot them coming in from a long enough distance away, we can send out an alert, and one of the local heavy units can be nicely sitting with a convoy going, "Hello, Mr. Surface Raider. So, as you can see, I have many 8-inch guns. Or many 6-inch guns. Or maybe, if I'm a real treat for you, I have 15-inch guns. So, what would you like to play?" That's sort of what the RN wanted them for. Convoy protection, maritime trade protection, choke points, and to an extent also the ferry role. Because as this comes out later, more in the mid-1930s, when you're having the whole discussion about the program of aircraft carriers and what leads up to the Inskip report, there are all sorts of interesting discussions. But someone actually makes a try from the Air Ministry. And please note, I'm going to say Air Ministry, not Air Force, because I don't think the Air Force personnel would have been so silly. But the Air Ministry, which was politically very interesting in the mid-1930s and a bit weird. Someone actually tried to make the case that what would happen in wartime is the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers would land all their aircraft, load up with bombers, take them to the Far East, and then come back and then take their aircraft out to the Far East to support naval operations. That's how they were planning on getting all the infrastructure, etc. needed for bomber forces out to the Far East. They had, of course, also talked about having an air road of bases, which the aircraft could go off from to get out to the Far East. However, someone had done an actual study. Someone had actually done an actual study on what effects that would have on the aircraft available at that period in terms of their reliability, in terms of their wear, and in terms of what would probably happen to the crews on that long trip. And whilst you can fly that route, if you want to fly that route taking out any ammunition, it's not going to happen. And if you want to fly that route taking out your fitters, it's not going to happen. They're not going to get there. Basically, you need the carriers. You need something to take them out en masse. And so what the Royal Navy turned around and said, sort of put forward, was, oh, well, that's what we have Argus for, and we were going to build, or rather procure, many ships which we're converting like Argus. That was pretty much what's put forward by the Royal Navy. I'm not sure exactly who put forward that in a meeting, but this is part of the reason why the Fleet Air Arm gets given back to the Navy. Because in Inskip's own report, he's listing this going, You cannot have something which is so fundamental to naval operations as their own naval aviation system have even the potential that it could be ordered off their ships without the permission of the service they are supporting, so that the other service can load them up with it. It completely derails the entire British plans for war. And you have to remember, the British, the Royal Navy, were expecting to arrive at Singapore and find a Japanese fleet heading for that. They're expecting to arrive at Singapore and have to fight a battle in the South China Sea. That's literally what they're expecting to do. You can't have those carriers drop off a load of bombers and turn around and have to go home then. The Royal Navy needs those carriers. They need the fighters, they need their strike aircraft, they need their reconnaissance assets. They cannot afford to be in that situation. So the RNs basically got them as escort carriers, and the Royal Navy has, in this period, sort of 3 designations for carriers. And the 3 are Strike Carrier, which is what you're sort of talking about when you're talking about Ark Royal. To an extent, Glorious, Courageous, and also what the Implacables was sort of originally designed on. They're the larger carriers which are designed for strike missions. They're designed for the... If your enemy fleet is hiding in harbour, that thing can dash in, launch a strike, and whack your fleet in harbour. The whole... We have torpedoes with tension wires and all sorts of other fun things to make them belly flop scenario going on. Fleet carriers, which are supposed to operate close in with the fleet, provide the ongoing persistent combat air patrol, the ongoing persistent strike capability, the ongoing persistent reconnaissance capability. Illustrious class, Furious, Eagle, those are good examples of that. And then the cruiser carrier role. Now, the cruiser carrier role always has a caveat. If it's a if it's built to naval standards, it's a cruiser carrier. It can also carry out scouting operations as well as escort operations, and it can also be something which is positioned forward. Escort carrier is sort of a grouping under that. And the idea is, well, we can also make, cruiser carriers, we're sort of talking Hermes. She's really a good example of it. Escort carrier is Argus, the merchant ship conversion to the role. And what's she going to be used for? Well, she can also be used for ferry duties, but she will also be used for the sort of escorting of convoys, but probably not the scouting role. That's not what you really want her for. And by scouting role, I don't necessarily mean what some people tend to go, oh, well, that means the British were going to use these carriers like the Japanese were using their cruisers with seaplanes. What? They're not. They're really not doing that. No, what the British were considering, it was almost flank scouting. So basically, the idea was the carriers, the fleet carriers, would keep up a view forward. Your strike carrier is your hidden asset, your hidden ace in the hole, that the admiral can order a strike from, and it will come in as a massed whoomp, the big punch, which the American and Japanese carriers tend to focus on because they're fighting in the Pacific, and in the Pacific, it is a big whoomp kind of fight. And that's why they're orientated, and their designs and structures are orientated that way. The British looking at fighting in the South China Sea and the Mediterranean, and also sort of the Atlantic, and they're sort of always having to balance the fact that they are going to need to do a lot of against land-based aviation, which will be an ongoing threat, as well as doing the big whoomp when they come across an enemy carrier fleet. If you're fighting in the Middle Pacific, your likely threat you're going to come from an aviation perspective is going to be another carrier force. So it's big whoomp strike on them. If you're in the South China Sea, there are a lot of air bases. If you're in the Mediterranean, there's a lot of air bases. You're going to have to be dealing with the persistent ongoing threat from land-based aviation, as well as potentially when you get to the Pacific. Because let's be honest, the only other threat for the British in carrier terms is America. We're going to count the burn as a threat. I know some people in the 1930s were considering we might have to fight the French, but I don't think at any point did the Royal Navy really consider the burn a serious threat. Definitely didn't consider it a serious threat. If you're fighting the Japanese, though, that's where you're going to have another carrier battle, and the British do have plans for that. They're basically the fleet is a defensive the fleet carriers provide defensive fleet for a screen for the fleet and provide the aviation screen. The scout carriers offer the flanks to make sure if the Japanese try any flanking maneuver, they will be spotted long before they get in a position to launch their strike from. And the strike carrier combined with all the other carriers, well, it's a night strike. And if you're using torpedo spotter reconnaissance aircraft as the bulk of your force for spotting, reconnaissance, and torpedo strike, then every single carrier is going to be carrying them. So you launch a mass strike at night with every dive bomber you can get. Remember, they procure as fighters because they can't get dive bombers through the Air Ministry because the Air Ministry doesn't believe dive bombers are a necessity at this point. Then they do for a very short period of time, and then they go. Technology evolves past them. What was really interesting is the Hawker Hart was always quite capable of dive bombing, as was therefore the Gloucester Gladiator and various other things. Some of the Royal Navy has an ongoing fighter program where the fighters are often able of doing a dive bombing operation, and technically the Swordfish can do dive bombing. Its dive bombing is different than everyone else because the Swordfish's dive bombing literally it's sort of going vertical, and it can almost hover there. So it's more like a helicopter in a way, positioning itself to drop a bomb vertically than dive bombing, but we'll leave that to one side. And basically the idea is mass night strike. We found the enemy fleet, we're shadowing them, one of those TSRs will be shadowing, or maybe one of the specialist shadowing aircraft will be shadowing the enemy from very high up, spotting, controlling the fleet, guiding in, and then the night strike goes in at night. Everything they can get hits the enemy at night, and then in the day you deal with what's left. Or in the if you've managed to arrange it perfectly, you surge forward the capital ships with destroyers and with some escorting destroyers and cruisers, and then as dawn breaks over a fleet which has been hit all night by aircraft, they suddenly find the battle line, the horizon erupting into fire. Or, if the British have managed to get it really good, and during the middle of the night, the Royal Navy closes and just keeps closing and closing and closing until they see the enemy turrets start to move, and then they fire. Like what they did at Matapan. Now, so what the RN wants from them? Escort carriers and ferries. What that affects what changes they make to them, because at the moment that they're thinking about them as escort carriers, they're thinking about them as getting something that's going to be high risk of getting torpedo strike, because they know these are going to be quite important for submarines to target. So they concentrate on their subdivision, make sure their watertight doors are really very good, really do work on making sure all these things work as well as they can, and they've got good flood prevention measures where they can. They dump the bombs. They also aviation fuel because they think they're going to get attacked by aircraft. They're going to be a #1 strike, especially for Bay of Biscay operations. And this is the other scenario you always have to remember when the British are making modifications. The British are thinking about these things operating in the Bay of Biscay, in the Arctic, in the Mediterranean. Again, there is a lot of land-based persistent air threat. It's a very different threat profile than the center of the Pacific. It's a very different... So it makes for changes. That's the point I always try to make when people say that, this ship is the best ship of all time. I go, it's perfect for the people who are using it. But there's a reason the equivalents produced by others are different. It's because no country has the exact same geostrategic profile in terms of their criteria of what they're going to be operating in. If the classic examples usually is World War II destroyers. People go, why, what's the equivalent of the British equivalent to the Fletchers? And you go, well, in some ways it's the tribal class, but in others it's the run-of-the-mill C class, which are their war emergency destroyers. They are building to fit their scenarios and their criteria. For the US Navy in the Pacific, the Fletchers make perfect sense and are an absolutely sublime design. But for the Royal Navy, with its infrastructure, its industry, and its geostrategic situation and what it's dealing with, they wouldn't be as good a fit. They'd still be a very good destroyer. They wouldn't be as good a fit for what the Royal Navy needs to. And it's the same with the changes the RN's making to them. They are making changes which are basically aviation fuel management system. Again, that, I have to say, is partially good sense because of where they're operating, but it's also partially due to the Royal Navy's paranoia. I've discussed this in so many videos, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but Ben Maishri basically is a World War One seaplane ship, and its has a fireboard and basically wipes out the whole aviation capabilities, etc. And the British from that point onwards get very paranoid about aviation fuel management. And one of the most critical things they do after World War One is they get hold of the German seaplane carriers. They have a look at their aviation fuel management systems. They try and get hold of everyone else's they can look at as well as their own. And then they develop a system. And they keep refining that. And there are generations of aviation fuel management system as it evolves. They don't just come out of in 1920 with the aviation fuel management system they use for the next 40 years and go, it's perfect. No. It has evolutions, and carriers all get upgraded fairly quickly. Almost as soon as they've upgraded and worked out a new bit for the aviation fuel management system, and it's a comprehensive system. It has drain back automatically, the fuel lines. The moment you stop using them to fill something, the fuel drains back. You have purging by gas. You have all sorts of different systems functioned into this fuel management system to make it as good as it can possibly be. And let's be honest, the Americans, when they go to look at it, first reaction to the British fuel management system is, oh my lord, how paranoid are these guys? Or obsessively paranoid. It's either an obsession or it's paranoia. We're not sure which. After about 2 years of war, they're looking at the British system going, what bits of this can we nick? Now, that makes sense. But it also, in part, is a lot of this stuff ends up building on some of the shared experiences they learned from operating these ships. The Charger/Avenger class HMS Dasher and what happens to her is a good example. See, she managed to lose 379 out of roughly 528 crew aboard. And that's down to fire. Fire is a horrendous thing. And I would argue the probable cause of it, because if you look at the US and British reports into it, and it's all sorts of muddled by some of the cover-up afterwards, and I'll explain that as a little bit. The British report focuses on the US methodology of stowage and system for handling petrol and aviation fuel. The Americans blame poor RN handling procedures, is their exact phraseology. But actually, poor is often how it's been changed over time. Actually, it says their handling procedures do not fit with the stowage systems. And that is the big problem. The British stowage methodology is different than the American, and the systems the British teach their sailors to use fit the British systems. This is another reason which leads to the whole implementation of the British stowing it and British methodology. Just because both nations speak English and both nations use imperial at this time measurements rather than metric for many things doesn't mean they're necessarily compatible. And the British methodology, and the thing is, the British are used to a system which automatically drains everything goes away. And that's reflected in their methodology of handling. The Americans don't have that on many of their ships at this period. They are still in the minds of what they need. So their systems reflect that they don't have that. So this it doesn't work. And that's more than likely where the issues start to spring from. The interesting things, though, about this ship and its loss are that at the time it's a critical juncture in Anglo-American relations. Everyone's worried about press, everyone's worried about opinions, and so they decide to cover up its loss a bit. Which means the hull, which is still afloat, it didn't sink, is first beached so it can be potentially repaired and assessed. When they decide they can't repair it, they tow it out to sea and scuttle it. It doesn't sink. It's beached. It's shore north of Adrasan is where it's beached, probably. The other discussions that come around it are mass graves and things, and no. That doesn't seem to be in the scenario at all. A lot of people that were recovered were housed in temporary locations before being buried in as the fashion that as the standards the Navy carried out at the time. But no, there's not the mass graves. And one of the reasons there isn't is people often underestimate just how hot fires get aboard ships. And that's the problem, basically. If you're on an escort carrier and it gets consumed by flames, you don't have much chance. You're in the equivalent of an oven. It's a steel box with a heat source that is ramping up to as hot as it can get. And that can be hot enough to burn through the hull itself. But interesting enough, from lesson of this, by the way, what happens is the Americans start taking a closer look at British aviation fuel management system, and as I said, every time they look closer, they like it more and they start taking it on. But how does that resolve itself? Well, in the escort carriers, both the British and the Americans cut down the amount of aviation fuel that's being carried. The British, to implement British stowage and handling procedures and provide space for that, so they cut it down far more than the Americans do. But the Americans still cut it down to implement other systems. And I always point out when people start usually talking about a system mistake, they often compare the American systems of 1945 with the British systems and go, yeah, they're about the same. They are very similar by that point. The American systems of 1941-42 versus the British systems of the equivalent period are not the same. But that's because I would argue the Americans are making a judgment call on weight and displacement and need based on their experience. They haven't had the same traumas the Royal Navy has had. They haven't had the same scenarios. And they also haven't been designing for operating, as said already and mentioned a lot, in Mediterranean and the South China Sea, where they expect to be in range of enemy air power, enemy land-based air power. If you're operating on a carrier in the Central Pacific and your whole thing is it's strike versus strike of carrier, the sheer quantity of weapons which are going to be chucked at you means that you don't have much chance. You're either going to dodge them or you're going to be gone. Because you get damaged, then the rest are just going to come in and it's like lions on a wounded gazelle. It's not a good scenario for anyone who's a gazelle in that scenario. Whereas if you're thinking about fighting in range of land-based air power, it could be a small strike damages you. You want to be able to manage that damage. You want to be able to deal with that and minimize that before the next one comes in, and the next one, and the next one. Because it's not a big whoomp, it's an ongoing da-da-da-da-da. What does the RN use them for? Pretty much everything you can imagine using them for. Ferries? Yes. Strike assets? Yes. Supporting operations off Salerno? Yeah, that was them. Pacific operations? Yes. Escorting convoys? Yes. Experimental work? Yes. Pretty much everything? Yes. The Royal Navy has a very open policy. When it comes with a flight deck, they will use it. They have needs, they will use them. And they do, a lot. And they're useful. Again, it's about the right size air group for so many of the minor roles. This is one of the things that gets me into interesting discussions when I'm talking to people about modern global operations. Often the question is, what's the modern escort carrier? I go, we don't have one. We don't. We have modern cruiser carriers. They were sort of the Invincible class, and some of the Japanese vessels probably fit that category. Some of the LHDs, etc., probably do fit that role. Then we have fleet carriers, and then we have super carriers. And the fact is, once you're dealing with vessels which are roughly 30 to 30,000 tons plus and operating 40 odd aircraft, you are talking about a fleet carrier in size. Some people try and persist with the idea that those are baby carriers. They're not. They're not. When you're literally 3 to 4 times the size of a World War II cruiser, you are not a baby carrier. These were lighter than World War II cruisers. Most light fleet carriers were not, well, were maximum twice their size in terms of displacement. So, what the Royal Canadian Navy used them for is another interesting discussion point. The RCN really liked Puncher and Nabob. They were really useful for them. The RCN is often forgotten in World War II as a carrier operator because they don't operate big carriers. They operate escort carriers for escort missions and for ferry missions and all sorts of other operations. But again, it's part of them being the most utilitarian navy of World War II. They were part of the Canadian Navy's growth to being the third largest navy in the world by the end of World War II. I'm sorry, Soviet Union. I am sorry so many nations who like to think that they were it. No, it was the Canadian Navy. They did it without having more than a couple of cruisers and a couple of escort carriers. But yes, they have quite that many trawlers, corvettes, destroyers, sloops, frigates, everything small and escort related, that they are in tonnage the third largest navy in the world at the end of World War II. The always interesting debate is exactly which position the Americans and the British Navy are in, because the American Navy passes the British Navy for a bit and then the Senate gets involved after the war is over. Then they go down behind the Royal Navy in size again. And then the British government eventually gets involved, and then it's the Korean War, and the US Navy goes bigger than the Royal Navy, and that's been the way ever since. But yeah, it's fun. But the RCN, they're really using them to grow their service. The fact that they then operate an aircraft carrier full, like fleet carrier, for so many years is based on the fact that they have built up their experience operating carriers. And I would also add that whilst these vessels are very much for the RCN, there have already been quite a heavy Canadian involvement in the Royal Navy's naval aviation program from the beginning, and the same with the Australians from the beginning, that they had a lot of layers of experience to build from. One of the things that's often misunderstood about the Royal Navies of the 1920s and 30s is just how much they are one navy. The US Navy understood that. That's why the US insisted on the treaty system treating them as one navy. They understood that. But a lot of people today don't understand it. They go, oh, how could it be one navy when it's multiple nations? They swore an oath to serve the same monarch. They pretty much were treated as indivisible. you are as likely to find, proportionally, you would find Royal Australian Navy officers, Royal Canadian Navy officers, and NCOs serving all across the Royal Navy, and you would find Royal Navy officers and NCOs serving all across the Australian and Canadian, and the same New Zealanders and South Africans. It's highly integrated. It makes modern alliance structures look like cells, as in that sort of, in each one's independent and doesn't connect with the others, in contrast to how the Royal Navy's 1920s and 30s were like. So, I forgot I didn't put a summary slide on this one. I decided I was going to use this for the summary, didn't I? I was finished these videos off with a question, and I realise I have touched on things like Dasher and other events, which are probably going to cause quite a lot of comments in their own way. But with these events, and with a lot of the ships which are involved, I'd like you to think about a modern escort carrier. I've been talking about this, light fleet carriers, conversions, and all these things in a lot of questions lately, but I would like you to think about a modern escort carrier. What is the smallest ship you can use? Now, theoretically, with helicopters, you can get quite small, because it can literally launch from a straight surface. But if you are looking for something which is going to be a reconnaissance asset, or at least a patrolling asset for convoys, which is going to provide them with some limited long-range air capability, because let's be honest, it's always better to deal with threats as far away from you as possible, and also anti-submarine warfare capability, etc. What are you going to build? Or rather, what merchant ship are you going to take up? And I would argue one of the problems we have today is that all the merchant ships are in many ways built too big to do this role. There are too few and too big, but I would love to hear your opinions on this. Because most of these ships, and most of the escort carriers in many, many ways, are based on the Type C3 class ships. Now, again, designs from the United States Maritime Commission trying to standardize merchant hull production through the war, and that's you have a whole load of them. You have, I think it goes up as high as, does it go C5s or C4s? I think they actually had designs which went up as high as C6s, but I think it's only Cs 1 to 4 which actually get built. And a lot of C4s are used for all sorts of fun things. But there are only 81 of those built. There are 238 C3s, there are 328 C2s, and that's the C1s. I don't think there are as many built. There might be. I think there's about 100 or so of those built. They're not Liberty ships, but they are another of those designs which are developed prior to war with the idea of being able to rapidly build up merchant fleets. Now, that's the thing. Liberty ship is kind of a wartime... I would often argue Liberty ship is the Essex to the C1s and the Marcom ships, Yorktowns, basically. These are the ships we are happy to build in peacetime, and also would love to have in wartime. Those are the capabilities. Liberty ships are, how can we take that design and make it built so we can go brrrr and turn out a lot of them? So I suppose, actually, when I'm asking this question, I should be asking two things. I should be asking, do we have an equivalent of the Marcom designs, do you think, today? That's the United States Maritime Commission. I'm going to use the American ones. The British had their own variations on this, but we'll leave that to one side. That the Marcoms, are far more of them are built. And If so, how would you convert that design to an escort carrier? And what would it be useful, do you think? Yeah. I should not have changed the question halfway through in my mind, but the Marcom ships... It was one of the problems in the previous version of the question, which I'd done in previous versions of the video. I didn't like... They weren't included in it. It didn't make sense. I think you need to include it. So with that all said, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found the video interesting. And what we've got coming up next week, it's 801 Squadron, which I'm hoping will be Tuesday. Because I will spend all of Monday re-recording it, and not spend all of Monday and Tuesday arguing with, and Wednesday arguing with editing, trying to get the sound to work and the sound issues to not happen, come through again. I do realise there was a video which went up yesterday which did have some sound issues in the middle of it. I'm hoping it won't happen again. I think I've found a way to stop that happening again, and I would be really happy if someone would tell me if there have been sound issues, as in somehow suddenly very quiet in this video at any point for any length of time. I do apologise if that happens. I am hoping with all the move once we're done, because I'm not usually in this much of a mess. Usually I've got books all over the place. I've not got boxes all over the place. Once the move's all done and in the office and have got much more space to have bookshelves and have things organised, that things will be improved, and I'll be able to set up the sound in there different than the sound in here, because the wood panelling plus the soundproofing has an interesting impact on tonal qualities. Combine that with some of the neighbours' fun, and it's a really interesting scenario. But I think the brew shack has been lovely, and we do now have a moving date. It's in August now. So expect to see a few more videos from in here, and a few more bottles of iron brew consumed in here. Speaking of that, I've got to get some. I've just run out. I need some for tomorrow's brew ships. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Oh, and while I'm remembering it, please note, if you're watching videos and you don't like lives, you like the recorded videos, anything which is labelled brew ships or patron, in terms of at the beginning of its title, is usually a live. I will also add live onto some of the ones which are not going forward, which are not a patron video. If you don't like lives, if you don't like that, if you find it distracting when I talk with chat and when I answer questions which occasionally go off on tangents or are slightly off topic, don't watch those videos. I'm saying this because there are 3 people, and I don't want to name names, who comment on almost every single live video they watch that they didn't like it because it goes off on topic and they can find it confusing, and every single recorded video that they enjoy it because it doesn't go off topic. And there is a common theme there. So please, I can almost predict word for word what your comment is going to say before I even read it, just by knowing what videos it's on. Save yourself the stress and me having to go through the comments and seeing them again and again and again. Just seems like a waste of effort. Watching something you don't like and writing the same comment again. Watch the recorded videos when they come out. There are always going to be recorded ones which do come out. Every single live, barring brew ships, has a long patrol equivalent. And yes, they often differ in some of the areas they cover, but they are always often cover the same sort of core points as well. But the difference is, in one I'm dealing with the thoughts of the people asking questions in the chat, and in the other I'm dealing with my own intrusive thoughts. Those can come up from all over the place. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed.